welcome to Haunted Hangover's 100 obscure horror films I've never seen. I'm Louie. Kind of been slacking on this challenge, so I'm trying to pick myself up and continue here with films 9 and 10. So recently I've been on a bit of a Coffin Joe kick, mostly because I purchased this box set from Arrow Video. And I remember back in the day around 2008, 2009, when I found out about Coffin Joe, I actually picked up this box set, the Coffin Joe Trilogy box set. Pretty cool packaging, looks like an actual coffin. And this only had 3 of Coffin Joe's films. And for many years, I never really got a chance to check out the rest of his filmography. And now thanks to this box set, the one I just showed off, this guy, I can now watch said movies, which there are a bunch here. I don't know, around maybe 10 films. I really only ever got to see his original trilogy. Funny enough, this Coffin Joe Trilogy Coffin box set features one of the films I never got around to seeing, which is also on the new Arrow box set. And it's one of the films featured in this episode that I'll be covering. Now, Coffin Joe is an actual person. His name is Jose Mojica Marins, I believe is how you pronounce it. And the character of Coffin Joe is sort of his persona that he's gone on to. Well, he's no longer around. He passed away, I believe, in 2020. But that was what he was most known for, portraying the character of Coffin Joe. Now, the best way I could describe this character, and if you do a Wikipedia, if you watch a documentary, which I did recently on this box set, there is a documentary that was released in 2001, I believe, that does a pretty good job at kind of letting you in on the kind of insane man that Jose Mojica Marins was, Coffin Joe. And when you look him up, this is kind of the words used to describe him many times in that doc, online, doing any research. He's Brazil's Freddy Krueger. The character's featured in many of Marin's films, specifically the 3 films I mentioned, the initial Coffin Joe trilogy, but he does get sprinkled throughout the rest of the movies as well. Even the films I'm going to be covering in this minisode, he's actually, the Coffin Joe persona is in the movie. Now, Jose Mojica Marins, as a filmmaker, he's notorious for being somewhat of a sadist. That documentary I mentioned, there's this funny kind of story he tells where he talks about actors that worked on his films dying after it was completed, and other actors being aware of this and telling Jose, like, look, dude, I don't want to die being a part in your film. And Coffin Joe, I'm just gonna call him Coffin Joe for the rest of the episode. The way he kind of is so nonchalant about it, he's like, listen, you never died on my set, you died after making the movie. A lot of his movies, I will be honest, a little misogynistic. These movies were made in the 60s, throughout the 70s. It's an acquired taste. I wouldn't say Coffin Joe movies are for everyone. I've always thought they were kind of charming in a very bizarre, masochistic way. There's a lot of slapping, a lot of beating, a lot of torture. All the movies are in Portuguese, by the way, so if you hate subtitles, you probably won't want to watch a Coffin Joe movie. If you don't like foreign films, if reading is not something you enjoy in your films, you might want to stay away from these. I've always thought the character was interesting. He kind of always gave me horror host vibes, which I believe Coffin Joe out in Brazil was at one point. He did have a TV show. I believe it's lost media now. There's no surviving footage of the program he used to host. I do want to point out too, he looks like a magician. Top hat, cape, long fingernails, jewelry, rings, medallions, bracelets. It's a very gaudy horror character. He's not the most scary or threatening looking figure with kind of a contemporary mindset. So if you're looking at this in 2026 today, you look at Coffin Joe and you're like, why were people scared of this guy? What was so spooky about him? You got to kind of put yourself in the shoes of people back in the day and kind of just the backstory behind his films. A lot of satanic imagery, a lot of anti-religion, again, a lot of misogyny, a lot of opinions on men, women, all kinds of wild stuff. There was definitely a political message behind his films as well. And I think that's what people mostly remember about Coffin Joe. If you're a fan of his movies, if you know maybe more than I do about this character. So that's been why I'm on a Coffin Joe kick right now, just kind of catching up on all of his movies I haven't seen. And this series of episodes, I'm going to probably go through the rest of this box set and share my thoughts of the movies on here. But yes, with all of that out of the way, let's get into film number 9. I look at that number and I tell myself, damn, Louis, you haven't even scratched the surface. You're not even halfway to 100 movies. Got a long way to go, but I'll get there, guys. 1968's The Strange World of Coffin Joe.
Agora, vê no terror que nada é terror. Não existe o terror. No entanto, o terror o aprisiona. O que é terror? Não aceita o terror porque o terror é você.
So this film was obviously directed by Coffin Joe himself, Jose Mojica Marins. It actually stars him as one of the principal roles in the movie as Coffin Joe. And then basically another version of Coffin Joe, but this time wearing a wig and with a different name. But if I'm being honest, it's basically the same character. So The Strange World of Coffin Joe is an anthology film made up of 3 separate stories, each featuring depraved acts like murder, torture, revenge, and Coffin Joe's speciality, necrophilia. I'm pretty sure this is not the first time that's come up in a Coffin Joe film, if I remember correctly. While not featuring a traditional wraparound segment like Creepshow, stuff like that, it does have an opening monologue from Coffin Joe as himself, and he rambles on about fear and death and how they're closely linked. I do like how this movie opens up with him sort of taking on that horror host gimmick. He opens the film, it's long-winded, he's introducing these stories. It works for this movie. From there, we transition into the opening credits. And now I don't plan on spoiling each story here, at least in the short breakdown I have. I'll dive into some small details in my 3 points of why you should watch The Strange World of Coffin Joe, because I do think people should watch this movie. It was quite entertaining. But I'm going to sprinkle it in a little bit, not fully mess the movie up for you if you are curious to see this. I don't want to give away too much. So I'll break down each one here. Couple sentence, nothing crazy. Story number 1 is titled The Doll Maker and features a talented doll maker who, with the help of his 4 daughters, creates these elaborate dolls with realistic eyes. Those realistic eyes are a very important detail to this segment. A dirtbag, or a group of dirtbags, I should say, led by one specific dirtbag, overhear the doll maker at a bar. He's making money. He sells someone a doll. They're seeing this. He's a very popular man, I'm assuming, in this town. And they decide they're going to break into his home and rob him because I guess he has a good he's living good because of selling these dolls. And if I'm being honest, this is my favorite of the 3 segments. It starts off with a bang. I'll be able to talk about it a little more in my 3 points. So we'll just move on here to the second story, which is titled Obsession. This story is about a mute hunchback peddler who sells balloons on the street and one day comes across a very pretty woman and quickly starts to become enamored by her. Super creepy, stalker vibes all the way. He follows her home. He watches her while she bathes. He is obsessed, as the title implies. Things take a deadly and bizarre turn in the final act, and you'll hear about that more in a second as well. Because this is probably the most gnarly of segments, but it does it so subtly. You're almost like, this is icky, but you don't see the full extent of where things go, if you know what I'm saying. And story number 3, the final one for this film, is titled Ideology. And this is my least favorite of all 3 segments in the film. Interestingly, this is the one that features Coffin Joe in a prominent role. This is the one where he's wearing the wig, the bad wig I mentioned in the opening there. So basically, in this story, he plays a professor with a stern opinion on relationships and attraction. He views it as something natural rather than spiritual. He kidnaps a rival professor and the professor's wife and basically tortures them, locks them up in cages, subjecting them to starvation, dehydration, bringing them to the point of desperation, all to prove his point that even the most loving couple would choose a selfish act to overcome a traumatic experience. He really wants to make a point to prove his beliefs on this other professor I guess he doesn't like, and the wife is just an innocent bystander. And finally, I can now get into my 3 points of why you should totally watch The Strange World of Coffin Joe. Number 1, for a film that I'm assuming was made on the cheap, inexpensively, it does feature some pretty good special effects, with the most memorable, in my opinion, being those dirt bags I mentioned from the Dollmaker story. Their heads severed on the ground, missing their eyes. Now you can tell that what they did was basically dug a hole in the ground, had the actor step into it, buried them, stuck their heads through the ground, added some gore, removed their eyes by sort of covering it with maybe latex. I don't know. This was 1968, so who knows what he was covering their eyes with. But it's a pretty cool looking effect, and it just goes to show you that Coffin Joe was working with what he had and was able to convince these actors to basically lie in a grave, kind of like Creepshow, funny enough, another anthology film where someone is buried into the ground with their head sticking out of it, similar to the Ted Danson segment with Leslie Nielsen from Creepshow. But they're all bloody and gross. It's a cool looking final shot for a segment. And speaking of that segment, The Dollmaker, the reason why it's my favorite of the bunch is because it feels the most like a Tales from the Crypt episode or a Twilight Zone episode. You know, you watch some of these shows and there's always like a revenge plot, or someone's trying to steal for someone and then they get their comeuppance and something worse happens to them because they're a piece of shit. I feel like this is what you expect. The Dollmaker segment is what you would expect from an anthology film. It's the kind of, this could have easily been remade and aired on Tales from the Dark Side. Like, it just works. You got the inclusion of dolls, dirt bags. There's way more sex in this segment because the dirt bags try to assault the Dollmaker's daughters. But overall, just like the presentation of this segment, if the Crypt Keeper popped up, it would make for like a Tales from the Crypt episode. It just would work perfectly. And that's my first kind of point. The effects, the story for the Dollmaker, hands down, one of my favorite things about this movie. I also, since we're on the subject of effects, I do want to say that the final segment, Ideology, even though it wasn't my favorite, it probably has the most blood and gore effects of all three segments because of all the torturing and whipping and stabbing. So that's probably the goriest of the three, but it doesn't make it the best of the three. Point number 2, for a film from 1968, it gets pretty shocking. Some of the stuff he's covering, kind of taboo, I'm guessing, for the time. Considering a film of this age, you didn't really see stuff like this. At least I haven't. There's not many movies covering the subject matter that Coffin Joe is covering. Lots of nudity, lots of violence. It's sadistic between the torturing, the necrophilia, the gore, all that stuff. I was surprised because if you think about it, 1968, around this time, the original Night of the Living Dead had come out. And even that movie has, reanimated corpses eating people. And I know Night of the Living Dead does have some scenes where the zombies are chomping on people, but it's still not as graphic or as violent as The Strange World of Coffin Joe. Just kind of where he went. Even something like necrophilia, it's kind of wild to think that in the 60s, we got a film like this. You think of a movie like Necromantic, which I believe came out, it was either the late 80s or early 90s, and that's a German film if you've never seen it. Pretty twisted, but very well made. That is an extreme, very graphic depiction of necrophilia. Here, it's way more subtle. You don't really see it. You just see the beginning. You see the aftermath. He didn't need to show us. We knew what was happening. And it's just kind of crazy to see a filmmaker this early in his career be willing to do all this crazy stuff. As weird as this sounds, it's kind of noble that he believed in his art that much. He believed in the films he was making to release this to people. And I'm sure in 1968, when people watched this movie and all of Coffin Joe's movies, if I'm being honest, they must have been shocked. People maybe were fainting because he does some wild, crazy stuff for a film that predates the 70s. Just all around craziness. And point number 3 of why you should watch The Strange World of Coffin Joe, the performances. I mentioned that necrophilia obsession segment. That's a prime example. So that entire segment, there's barely any dialogue. It's a very physical performance. The main hunchback dude with the balloons, he doesn't say anything. Even the main girl that he's obsessed with, I think she has like a couple of lines, and it's mostly when she's killed because she's murdered at her wedding. That's how she becomes a corpse. But he was able to achieve this. Coffin Joe, as a director, and the actor playing the mute hunchback, they were able to achieve this entire sequence and tell this story without any, like a single sentence coming from this guy. It's all emotion, his sadness, how happy he is when he's creepy, when he's doing vile things at her wake. Like, you can all just sort of, he uses his face so much to tell the story. And I thought that was ahead of its time, how artistic Coffin Joe decided to take this specific portion of the film and have no monologues, no dialogue, just this one dude leading the charge, telling the story, doing these disgusting things, and it's all completely quiet. Even when he goes to the tomb to go open up her coffin, there's like a thunderstorm. It's quiet. He's doing his thing, and he doesn't say a peep, not a single word. And the rest of the film too has some solid performances. You would expect them to be a little over the top. Honestly, Coffin Joe is probably the most over the top actor of everyone. Even the people that in the ideology segment that he chains up and puts them in cages, they're not even overacting. It feels like they're genuinely being tortured, which, considering the director, they might have been. So there's a certain realism to all the performances, and I was just kind of taken back. I was like, wow, these actors are pretty good. They did a great job for a film of this caliber. So to me, The Strange World of Coffin Joe, 2 thumbs up. I'd recommend it. If you don't know anything about Coffin Joe, this might be a good place to start, even before his trilogy, in my opinion. The trilogy, you can't touch those 3 movies, kind of the narrative, the plot device through all 3 of them. But I think this is a good place to kind of just see what kind of filmmaker Coffin Joe was, and his taste, and kind of the different type of movies and stories he could tell. And then you even get a little bit of the signature Coffin Joe in there, kind of leading the charge. And that takes us to film number 10. And in my opinion, this one's a little bit more of an acquired taste. The epitome of not for everyone, in my opinion. 1970s Awakening of the Beast.
Forças benignas ou malignas jamais irão se interpor entre o mortal estigmatizado por mim.
This is a bizarre movie. Coffin Joe is back again, playing himself. So he's playing Jose Marins, and then he's playing Coffin Joe. So a lot of fourth wall breaking in Awakening of the Beast. So the film plays out as sort of an allegory for drug use, specifically LSD. It was 1970, and how it affects the human mind, making people violent and perverse. We meet 3 psychiatrists. Marins, Coffin Joe, he plays one of them, on a television program, each sharing scenarios of people taking drugs and going wild. Now, I want to put a pause here on my little breakdown of Awakening of the Beast, because my main kind of gripe with this movie is the editing is a little rough, because you've got these 3 psychiatrists in the room, and you get a little disoriented because you can't quite tell what's happening, because you go from these scenarios, which I have a little list here of some of the stuff that happens in this movie. You go to these scenarios with the psychiatrist explaining to each other like the effects that LSD and drugs did to these specific people during these different times that they took the drugs. And it kind of bounces around. So at times I was just like, okay, did this actually happen? Is this just a story? Is this a case file? Maybe it was just me, but yeah, the editing was just a little rough in kind of how it bounces between the 3 psychiatrists and then all these different scenarios, and then goes into sort of one of the main psychiatrists, his main experiment, which is, I would say, the last 30 minutes of this film. That was like my main gripe with Awakening of the Beast. But yeah, as far as the scenario goes that I discussed, we get a hippie cult band orgy featuring one girl high on LSD. Maybe the hippies were too. I don't remember if they took drugs, because you see her doing it. And a lot of fingers. One girl, lots of fingers. I'll let you guys figure out where that one goes. I'm sure you could use your imagination. But yeah, there's infidelity, there's abuse, a lot of smacking of women and people. It's a little rough at times to watch. There's horses, random ladies petting horses. Who knows what she was doing with those horses? We get butlers having affairs with daughters. A lot of underwear removal and sniffing. All these scenarios are kind of ridiculous. They're almost played up as like really bad Scared Straight videos. Like if you know the Scared Straight videos from like the 80s and 70s, 80s, I even think the 90s, that's what they kind of come off as, like just bizarre. Like, don't do LSD, kids, or you'll end up in a hippie orgy, or you'll end up sniffing underwear and smacking somebody. Very strange. I get what they were going for, because they wanted to show how the drugs were affecting these people, but it just comes off as like almost not even like I wouldn't even say comparing it to like David Lynch weird. At least that was a little artistic. This just seems like shock for shock's sake. From that point on, the story transitions with the main psychiatrist, Dr. Sergio, wanting to experiment on 4 individuals. He injects them with drugs, takes them to a show, a bar, and finally a Coffin Joe movie, and eventually has them stare at a Coffin Joe poster. From here, we transition to color. The film's all black and white until the very final act. And we get this trippy extended sequence featuring Marins as Coffin Joe in a hellish landscape, which in all honesty, it almost plays like a Coffin Joe haunted attraction. Like if this was a haunted house, it would be the most amazing haunted house during the Halloween season ever. Like, I wonder if Coffin Joe ever had a haunted attraction. I mean, he's tailor-made for something like that. But yeah, we get graveyards, crosses, half-naked people, fire, scary mask, bush creatures, murder, statues, smacking once again, whipping, and probably the most baffling visual, butts, human butts, lined up and painted with faces on them. No lie. This is something you see during their trip. And I think the painted butts pretty much sum up this sequence in a nutshell. And if I'm being honest, the ending is a little, while it's cool, it's just as absurd as everything before it. It just does it in color. So I'm bringing something back that I've done before for entry number 10 here, Awakening of the Beast. What I'm going to do is this, because I honestly don't think this movie will be everyone's cup of tea. It is out there. So I'm going to have 2 points of why you should watch Awakening of the Beast and 1 point of why you probably shouldn't watch Awakening of the Beast. And if I'm being honest, there's probably a larger audience of people that will put this on and 15 minutes in, turn it off and be like, WTF was that? So point number 1 of why you should watch Awakening of the Beast, its commitment to authenticity to a degree. Let me explain. The film feels like you're on drugs, which I think that's supposed to be the point. It's very bizarre. I can't imagine actually being on some sort of hallucinogenic and then watching this flick. That just sounds like a recipe for disaster. Also, the actual contraband on screen, I would not be surprised if it's the real deal. Like the amount of smoking and shooting up you see in this, I guarantee some of those actors, especially because Coffin Joe directed this, some of those actors probably like Method. I need to see what it feels like to be high on LSD. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of them actually took the stuff. Speaking of the syringes, if you get queasy at the sight of a needle puncturing someone's skin, I'd skip this one. You see it a couple times throughout the film. And when I say a couple, at least 2 or 3, and every shot is like this, dead on, up close, doesn't cut away. They really are injecting themselves with something on screen. They're really smoking stuff. They're really snorting stuff. My main point, yeah, I think drugs were actually involved in the making of this film. I would love to maybe look into it a little more in the future, but I would not be surprised if some people were high while making this. Probably Coffin Joe himself. Point number 2 of why you should watch Awakening of the Beast. The drug-fueled trip with the 4 participants in the experiment is a well-crafted sequence. Surreal visuals. You can tell a lot of effort was put into it. Great set design. The special effects for a film from 1970. Just like Strange World of Coffin Joe, I think they did a great job. You can see that love and passion was put into this sequence. And it kind of adds a bizarre atmosphere to the whole thing. You know, you can tell that the script, when it was written, was leading to this trippy, weird sequence. Like, you can just tell. And this isn't the first time Coffin Joe has done this. He has one of his other films, he does the same thing where the final act of it, or towards the ending of the film, is in color. So this was sort of his thing. And when you watch it, you can just tell, like, he was probably really excited filming this sequence, knowing it would all be in color, and just feels like a drug-fueled nightmare. If that was his goal, he achieved it. And finally, my one point of why you might want to skip Awakening of the Beast. It just might be too weird for some people. And if I'm being honest, it's a little self-indulgent at times. You know, the whole ending. I didn't really get into the very end of the movie because I wanted to save it for my one point of maybe why you should skip this one. So it turns out that the hallucination drug nightmare sequence that you see, the participants, the 4 people, were not on drugs. They were just insane. And I guess looking at the Coffin Joe poster and maybe his movie woke something up inside of them that drove them crazy. Almost as if Coffin Joe is so evil, he causes people to go psycho. So to me, I was like, all right, dude, like, you're a guy wearing I love you. I love Coffin Joe, but you're a dude wearing a top hat and a cape with long fingernails. Like, there's nothing about him that's inherently scary or evil or would drive someone to insanity. So the fact that he was like, I do make people go crazy. I was like, all right, that goes back to the self-indulgent situation for like he wrote this to tell people, like, I am so crazy and evil. I am Coffin Joe. You are going to go mad after you watch my movie. I'm just like, all right, dude, you're like patting yourself on the back there at this point. Like, I just didn't like that. But mostly the weird portions of it, I just don't think people will care much for this movie. It's just like, all right, get to the point. Where is this going? Maybe even get bored by some of it. Like, you know, you can see someone doing drugs and acting crazy, but so many times. And I could see it kind of, it gets tired quick, especially like that first hour where we're cutting through all the weird different scenarios that the psychiatrists, the different cases that they're talking about. You're just like, all right, what is the point of this movie? And then they get to the point and you're like, all right, this whole thing was basically that people are driven crazy by Coffin Joe, and there's something inside of all of us that Coffin Joe or something horrific can bring out of us, and we don't need the help of drugs for it. I get what he was giving, but I don't know if I want to take it. Get what I'm saying? And one more thing about Awakening the Beast before I close out the show. I didn't hate this movie. It's just not a Coffin Joe movie I would recommend to first-time viewers of this character. I just don't think it does a great job showing off, you know, Coffin Joe as a character, or even the filmmaker, the man behind the character. I just don't think it does a good job. Is it terrible? No. Have I seen worse? Yes, 100%. But I just don't think it's the definition of a Coffin Joe film. And listen, I'm going to continue through this box set the next couple episodes, and we'll see. There might be a film that Coffin Joe directed that is worse than Awakening of the Beast. So we'll see next time. So those were films 9 and 10 in my 100 obscure horror films I've never seen challenge. Be sure to subscribe, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Blue Sky, Facebook, all that good stuff at Haunted Hangover. Head over to hauntedhangover.com, where you can find links to everything, including our Patreon page, where if you want to show us a little support, you'll gain access to bonus content. Rate and review us. It'd be greatly appreciated. And as always, remember, the best cure for a hangover is more booze. Catch you guys later.